somehow. Oh, there we go. Okay. Welcome to White River Nursery. Thanks for coming out, sharing your beautiful Saturday with us. My name is Charity, and we're glad to have you all here. I know many of you have been here many times. This is our second class of the year, and we have some more coming, so pay attention to social media, emails, and all that stuff to find out what's happening next. Today we do have honed in sharpening service out. I'm sure you saw him. He's already quite busy, so if you have anything you need him to do after class, he can definitely sharpen those up very quick. Also, he's available on the square and by house call, which is pretty cool. So today we're going to talk about fruit tree pruning with Colin, who has come out and done this class a couple of years ago for us. Colin is pretty recognizable to most people since he teaches a lot of the Master Gardener classes, does lots of presentations around town. And I don't know all his accolades. He's just all around a swell guy, and he knows lots of things about plants. So he's a winner, right? Oh gosh, that's copyrighted. Okay. So yeah. So thanks for coming, and I'll let Colin start teaching you. If you do have any questions after the class about any of our inventory, we do have our apples and pears in, so and other fruiting trees, some native. So if you have any questions, find one of our staff members.
Y'all hear me okay? Yeah. Excellent. So I'm Colin Massey. I'm your Washington County Extension Agent for horticulture. We're going to spend about an hour together today. I'll preface this by saying there's a chance I might get an emergency phone call during this, and if so, I'll have to take it and step away for a second. But what I want to do, I've just got a little agenda here. We're going to talk about the basics of tree health and pruning. Now, there's going to be some pruning principles in here that I'm going to refer to ornamental trees. It's also going to apply to fruit trees, and we'll kind of hone in on that. We'll hopefully have, I think I'll probably talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. I'm going to try to do a couple little, demonstrations to apply these principles right in front of you. So then we'll do a wrap up and a Q&A. So this might be a little bit hard to see for you, but I first want to talk about what you need to look for when purchasing trees, okay? Some of this is my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, but I say you usually get what you pay for. And I would say that for tools as well. You usually get what you pay for, and I'm an advocate for sometimes paying a little bit more for something that's going to be quality and durable and stand up to the test of time a little bit longer. So I'd say beware of bargain plants. I'm not here to knock anyone, but I've just noticed I've had to restrain myself from talking to strangers in certain stores before. Say, wow, look, they've got all these fruit trees and all these bushes, but there's no variety name on them. You don't know where they've come from. You don't know if they're adapted to this area. So I would certainly recommend looking for that and also cross-referencing that with our fact sheets. We have a great website with a fact sheet for any fruit or vegetable that you can grow in Arkansas. It lists variety names for things that have been tested and evaluated in the field here, okay? So just be careful with that. So buy from a reputable dealer. We're going to be trying to look for healthy and disease-free trees, so it's going to require a little bit of inspection on the front end to make sure that we don't have something that's severely broken or major wounds or something like that. Generally, we see better success with starting out with a smaller plant and working to establish that root system. That can be tough for some people because you want to get fruit right away. I get that. But generally, you're going to have better success, but it's going to require a little bit of patience. We're going to probably come up to that word again a little bit later. So check your labels to make sure it's a desired rootstock. If it lists that, it may not. A lot of fruit trees are sold bare root, and those are usually planted when dormant. The ideal time to plant is going to be in the fall. Late fall, between I'd say November and any time during dormancy is ideal. although they can be planted in the spring. But the thing you're gonna have to watch out for if you've been here for a couple of years is summer drought. It's gonna be a little bit more work. Even during dormancy, those roots are gonna continue to grow and establish even though you don't see anything happening. And it's gonna make it a little bit more resilient because it's had the few months of time to help get established. The other thing is really depth. So if you are starting with something like these whips or something small, many of your fruit trees are grafted, right? You don't ever want that graft to be below the soil line. And what you might see then are suckers coming up. That sucker's off the rootstock, and it's probably not going to be desirable fruit. Similarly, with something like this, even this applies to ornamental trees as well. We want to make sure we're not planting them too deep. I see it way too often, and you're going to run into issues of Phytophthora root rot. That's a fungus that affects plants when the soil is saturated. And if we plant things too deep, you're going to run into it. So what we want to see is the beginning of this root flare. You can see how the trunk goes down and it starts to flare outward. We want to see that at the soil line or slightly above, not below. Okay? Okay, so some tree health basics. Why do we prune? Anybody want to take a guess? Whether it's ornamental or fruit trees? Do trees need to be pruned at all?
Better protection, more airflow.
For our purposes with fruit trees, yeah, we're trying to produce healthy, productive fruit. Okay, but there are trees out in the forest. Nobody's pruning them. They're doing fine. Okay, so often pruning is for our purposes. A lot of times it's aesthetics. It could be for safety, but specifically with fruit trees, we are pruning for disease management and production. Right? Some starting principles with that health, kind of a tiered approach to pruning, whether it's ornamental or fruit trees. Our first choice, and this can happen any time of year, is dead or diseased wood. If you're seeing something that's dying, it's not going to be productive, we want to get rid of that. It's not contributing, it's detracting from the health of the tree, correct? So I would say anytime you see that, take it out. We're also going to be pruning for structure, okay? For good scaffolding and lateral branches that are coming out that are going to support a fruit load. What would be an example of something in here that I probably would not want as far as being able to support a good fruit load? Anybody see anything? Crossing,
One
yes.
going towards the middle.
Or something that's going straight up. It's probably not going to be, it's not as strong as something, a branch that's coming out at 60 or 90 degrees is much stronger than a branch that's going perfectly straight up. Okay? So, yes, those crossing branches, why would that be a problem? Well, this one's, it's rubbing. And you could even look at this and see where the wind has moved it, it's rubbed, it could create a wound over time. Wounds are a foothold for disease to enter into that vascular system. Okay. Also, I just mentioned those what we would call tight crotch angles. A branch that's coming up almost vertically, it doesn't have the same kind of strength. It's going to be more prone to breakage. We might be pruning to eliminate hazards. That's not really a case usually with a fruit tree, but with ornamental trees, that's possibly overhanging a structure like our home or our shed that if it fell would cause possible substantial financial damage or damage, a concern to human health. With fruit trees, we're also trying to prune to control the size of the plant. We got to be able to reach something to harvest it, correct? So we'll talk about that. And then sometimes it's just aesthetics. That's more on the ornamental side. So yes, we mentioned for fruit trees, the goal is high quality fruit, but it's also for disease and insect control. Developing good structure, the dwarfing process, controlling its size, and keeping plants productive. So a general rule of thumb, this depends on who you talk to, is in a given year, for both fruit trees or ornamental trees, how much is okay to take off? How much is too much? What's that?
1/3 at the most.
1/3 at the most, and there's times where I'm probably more like a quarter. Okay, why would that be? Why, what happened if we cut too much out? What's the problem?
Won't be able to support itself if energy created by the leaves.
Right, right. We'll talk about topping in a minute, why that's a concern. But also, pruning, we're creating wounds, but we're also, it can be stimulating to the plant. We're starting to get into some growth hormones, okay? And if we take too much off, it sends a stress signal to the plant, like, hey, I need to make sure I've got enough leaves to support this root system. And it flushes out with typically very weak, very vertical growth called water sprouts or suckers. Generally, I call it water sprouts, or when they're coming up from the bottom, or it could be either way. They're the same thing, right? But you're gonna overstimulate the plant by pruning too much. Okay. So is anybody growing fruit trees right now? You folks, yeah. Success, is it a bit challenging so far? Or is it?
Totally, you die. Oh.
It can be challenging to grow fruit trees, especially certain types of fruit trees in Northwest Arkansas, due to our climate. Disease requires what we call it the disease triangle. You have to have a host plant, you have to have the right environment, and the pathogen has to be present. And that's one way that we can what we're talking about with pruning is trying to kind of control that environment. Because the pathogen may be around, the host may be around, but if we've limited its environment, we're trying to severely minimize the chance that disease is going to have a chance to take hold. But we are characterized by typically cool, wet springs and very humid summers, which is a perfect environment for disease and insect pests. And this would be especially true for something like the stone fruits, the peaches. And I love peaches, but you couldn't pay me to try to grow one. Let me rephrase that. If you're trying to do it organically, it's near impossible. If you have a rigid spray program, it can be done, but it's going to become very important to choose the right variety that has long chilling hours. Many of these plants that you might go buy that you don't know the variety of, they may grow somewhere where their dormancy period is only 600 to 800 hours of cold around 45 degrees, and you have a week like we've had this week, it's going to start coming out. And we've had snow here in May, we've had freezing temperatures in April and May. It's going to smoke those blooms, and you're not going to get any production. Okay. So that humidity plays a big part in our disease pressure. So for me, it's generally a little bit more of a pleasant experience with the apples and pears and any kind of native fruits that we have. And I'll mention some of those a little bit later. And then cultivar adaptation. This is where it's also really important to look at those varieties and those cultivars for a cultural integrated pest management control, which is choosing a variety that has natural resistance to a lot of the diseases that we're used to seeing. And we'll mention some of those as well. This is that disease triangle I mentioned. Again, it's just the host, the environment, and the pathogen. And if we can minimize one of those things, if we buy a variety that's resistant to the pathogen that we have, we've really kind of taken that out of the equation. But remember, resistance doesn't mean immunity. We learned that with COVID, right? This is an example. Has anybody seen fire blight before? This is a very common disease we see on apples, susceptible apples and pears.
And pawpaws, I saw that.
You saw it in pawpaw?
Yeah, well, it looked like that.
Huh? I've never seen it in pawpaw. It could have been something else, but I'm not saying it couldn't happen there. But typically affects plants in the rose family, which most of these tree fruits are a part of. Okay, it's a bacterial disease. A lot of people think it's fungal. It's actually bacterial. It's incredibly difficult to control. You might see some sprays for this, and I have not found them to be terribly effective. And we'll talk about, if you see that, it's called fire blight because they look like they've been burned. And you'll often get this kind of shepherd's crooking to the leaves, they'll crook over. And you'll also see, I know it's difficult for you, typically you'll see a canker on there. A canker is a wound that will continue to produce spores that infect other parts of the plant. So if we have this, we need to get it out of there. And this can be a little bit dicey because you can spread those spores with your pruners. So it's important to clean your tools after each cut if you have this. If we had fire blight, let's say on this branch, just on the end, I'm going at least 8 inches away from the point where I see that disease affecting the branch. I'm probably going to come back and make a thinning cut back to the origin, and then we need to either destroy or burn that so that it's not just sitting on the ground and possibly those spores continuing to get kicked up. Okay, when do we prune? Well, I said in one case, any time of year if it's dead or diseased, right? But generally for maintenance pruning is going to be like right now. Now, things in science change, don't they? It's part of being a scientist and observing things. And used to we would say in the fall. That has changed in the last decade or two. That we would say you want to prune in the late dormancy period. And what we're trying to do is minimize the time that wound is sitting open, just in case we get warm weather like this and there might be spores going around. But we're also trying to time it with that flush of spring growth. So we've minimized the amount of time the wound is there. We've made those pruning cuts, and then it starts to grow. It's going to heal over faster. Okay, trying to minimize that chance of disease. It's also a little bit easy. If this was fully flush with leaves, it'd be kind of tough, wouldn't it? To really get in there and see, you're gonna have to pull stuff apart. So it's easier to see the structure of the tree when it's dormant and doesn't have leaves on it. We can make better management decisions during that period. Also, the bark is less likely to tear. I'm gonna show you a 3-cut technique, especially is important with larger branches. If we had a very heavy branch and we came and tried to just saw it off here, obviously it'd be something bigger than this. The weight of that branch could fall and it could strip the bark down, leaving us with a wound that's going to take a large wound. It's going to take a long time to heal over, correct? And also, just again, those lower temperatures, the threat of disease or spores being active is typically minimized. So we talked about diseased or damaged anytime. Now, I'll mention a little bit about summer pruning. This is something that can be done to control growth or improve light penetration. It's kind of a rescue pruning, if you will, during the summer. If it's become too lush, maybe you over pruned a little bit, you've got a lot of water sprouts and suckers. And the key point here to take away from all of this is what we're trying to do within the canopy of the tree is to create light penetration and air movement. And why would that be? Thinking about that disease triangle, moisture is really one of those vectors of environment and that disease being able to take hold on a plant. If we can minimize the amount of time that dew or water is just sitting there, and if we can make that dry faster, we're going to minimize our chance for disease. Okay, so light penetration and air circulation is the key. So we might be doing that in the summer. We're possibly having to thin really heavy fruit loads if we're not doing actual fruit pruning. And what that means is say we had a bunch of 5 apples here and this branch was really struggling to hold up. We might need to go take 2 or 3 of those off. It's also going to give us more resources are going to be put into those 2 that are left. So you get larger, more productive fruit versus 5 small ones. That makes sense? Okay. And it's a good time, again, to remove those water sprouts or upright growth. Now it can be, depends really kind of on the time. It could be also stimulating. It could cause more water sprouts, but that's something that's fairly easy to manage if you don't over prune. So pruning and training are 2 of the most important cultural practices. Keep using that word. Pruning is limb removal. Training is trying to control the direction. I'll show you a photo of what that looks like. Another cultural control we already talked about would be variety selection. If you can see this is an example of training. They're trying to, this branch was maybe a little bit too tight, but they liked it, all right? They wanted to keep it, so they put in a brace to try to push that limb more outward and lower so that it can have, basically build up strength where it connects back to the main trunk and support a better fruit load. So training produces stronger crotch angles, but this needs to be done early. It's going to be more difficult the more mature the tree is. This is what I keep using this terminology. This is a good visual representation of a narrow crotch angle versus one that's more strong. So in this, you see that swollen area, we call that the branch collar. That provides a lot of strength. That's very strong tissue versus something that you see a lot, like, for example, what happens to Bradford pears when it ices? They split, right? And this is the reason that they split. This connection is very weak. It's almost, the fibers of that are almost like pages of a book. And when it gets heavy, the book opens and it splits. That does not occur when we have good, strong branch collars. So pruning to control shape. Most of what we're dealing with are central leaders. I'll show a picture of that as well. But a branch is going to control in the direction of the bud. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip to an example right here. We'll see a picture of this later, but this is what we would call a width. Generally, when we get these, we would say this is the only time that you're ever going to top a tree. The only time is when it's this small. So why would we do that? Why would we come in and cut off the top? Right, the answer was that it's so that it will start making branches. There's a lot of growth hormone right here that's saying, I'm going up, I'm going up. And we want to manipulate that. So we would come find an outward facing bud and make a cut at that angle. We're modifying that. That's going to make a new leader, but it's also going to stimulate a lot of these buds down the stem to start coming out and making branches. And it's the only time we're ever going to top a tree. So generally with our apples and pears, we're looking at an upright central leader type of growth. With stone fruits, mainly because of that disease, and we need more air and light in the internal canopy of that tree, we're doing what's called kind of an open center. It's like an upside down umbrella to really promote air and light. Let's talk really quickly about pruning tools. With fruit trees, you can really get away with some fairly minimal tools. Most of the time, I'm using hand pruners for smaller cuts, but if a branch gets a ½ inch or bigger, it starts to get kind of tough. So you may be using loppers. And it's very important to have good sharp tools. I would say clean. These don't look very clean. They've kind of been through the ringer. So you can do sharpening yourself. You can bring it to Mr. Tyler Eck. I've got a little sharpener here if I'm doing a lot of pruning on, like, say, blackberries or fruit trees. After every 50 or 100 cuts, I might come and just kind of hone that in a little bit, going away from the pivot point. Okay, pretty cheap tool. For branches larger than that, again, the loppers will maybe work. But something larger than that, especially on ornamentals, you might need a good sturdy tree saw. I like this folding tree saw, it's really sturdy. But at some point, you might even need a chainsaw. But I would say if you're gonna do that, take a chainsaw safety education course if you're not familiar with using one. Does anybody use one of the, a pole saw would be another one that we might use for things that are a little bit taller. Does anybody use one of the battery powered ones?
We could, yes.
What do you think?
Yeah, I like
Worked
that.
all right?
Yeah.
I've been considering getting one. I was just kind of curious what the thoughts were. Also, I would recommend some hand protection, some gloves. I've cut myself numerous times just by something slipping or going through, so do try to be protective. If you're using a chainsaw, you know, there might be more protective chaps, or maybe in face protection, ear protection, that kind of thing. So that's just going through sharpening. We don't need to spend too much time on that, but it's usually away from the blade. Keep that in mind. And then keep them clean. You might need some annual lubrication on some of these joints, but the cleaner you can keep your tools, the longer they're going to last. Okay? And then storing properly, not out in the rain. If they get rusty, you can go at them with some steel wool, some sandpaper, and then maybe a light coating of mineral oil to help bring that sheen back a little bit. Okay. So let's talk about some fruit tree anatomy here, right? So we've got our main trunk. We would call these either secondary branches or scaffolds, but that main trunk, I'm going to use this term quite a bit, the primary leader. It's the boss, okay? And then off of those, we also, off of our main or secondary branches, we have what we call laterals and lateral buds, or fruits. You'll start to see fruit spurs develop, where that's going to be where the fruit actually grows off of. Okay. So let's start talking about different kinds of cuts. Oh, I forgot to, we already talked about suckers and water sprouts as well. What types of cuts are we using? Well, we have really two, but I've separated them into three. The preferred method is going to be a thinning cut. And what this is taking a branch back, cutting a branch back to its point of origin. So if everyone can see this, an example of a thinning cut would be me coming in and cutting it off here back to the main trunk. It's less invigorating. You're going to get much fewer water sprouts and suckers by doing thinning cuts. Reduction cuts or heading cuts are kind of indiscriminate. It'd be like taking a hedge trimmer and just zzz, right? So then you've got a branch that's just cut off right here. It's a wound, especially in a larger branch. It's probably not going to fully heal over, and we've maybe removed a lot of buds by doing that. So it's somewhat indiscriminate, and it's much more invigorating. So what's an extreme example of heading or reduction cuts that I've already mentioned? Topping. That's a lot of reduction cuts, and it's basically dooming a tree to death. It's a horrible practice, and if you've ever looked at a tree that's been topped a season after, all you're looking at are water sprouts. A lot of upright growth that's very weak and prone to breaking. It also has what's called kind of a witch's brooming or a lion's mating effect. It's very weak. It's also very tender growth that is more susceptible to disease. But I mean, think about if someone cut your head off, right? I mean, trees don't want that to happen. And it usually dooms them to a quick or a moderate death. Because many open wounds that are not going to be able to heal over and that are an opening for disease. Another wrong type of cut would be called a flush cut. And I don't know if you can see this, but they've done it. They've gotten as close as they can to the trunk and sliced that off. The problem is, do you remember that picture I showed you where the area was kind of swollen, right where it connects to the main trunk? That branch collar? We want to cut just outside of that. That's where all the plumbing is. That's where that healing tissue is. So if we do a flush cut, we've taken off all those healing cells. And that is going to maintain a wound, an open wound there. Trying to see a little bit better example of that. These have a slight branch collar. So it's kind of counterintuitive. It's going to look kind of funny that there's going to be a little stub there. But if you go look at really large mature oaks, you'll kind of see this rounded thing on the outside of one that's been properly pruned. Its bark has completely healed over that, the cambium, right? What we don't want to do is come and cut it off out here. That's basically, we tried to do the right thing, but we've still basically done a reduction cut. And the healing wants to happen down here. And so you'll often see kind of that collar just holding around a dead stem, kind of like a straw. And if that straw, it's going to start decaying, and it might suck some of those pathogens into the main vascular tissue of the trunk. Okay. Also, we no longer recommend any kind of paint or wound spray. You see these like a spray paint can that tends to trap moisture behind that and increase rapid decay. So it's better to leave it alone and let it heal over naturally. So we're, again, cut outside of that branch collar. This just shows that again. These are those heading cuts that just cut off the tips. Now this could be useful. That's why I kind of threw that other word in there, the reduction cut. Because maybe this branch is just too long, but we still like its structure, and we cut back to a bud that's going to go a direction that we want. Let's say I came and just cut this tip off, there's a bud down here. Well, now that branch, instead of going up, is going to come out. That's okay to some degree, okay? And again, thinning cut back to the point of origin. How am I doing on time here? Okay, we're all right. This is one I really want to talk. So large branches. This is called the 3-cut method. Really smart name. Okay. But what we're dealing here is something that's really heavy. And as I mentioned before, we don't want to just come and start cutting this right out. This is a good example of that branch collar. You see that larger area? It's kind of like the root flare, right? That's coming off the trunk. But we don't want to come cut this off right here because that's going to start to fall and it may take bark with it, especially on thin bark trees like maples or young fruit trees. So the first cut we're going to come in and make is actually on the underside, about a quarter or a halfway through that branch. And this is where this saw would come in very handy. So I'm going to get up there and I'm going to go back and forth. And then my second cut's going to be just outside of that, and that creates a notch. And as soon as you get about halfway through that, it's going to break off at that notch. You've reduced the weight, and then you can come in and cut outside of that branch collar without fear of that weight stripping bark off the tree. Any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Okay, we're going to get kind of into a little bit of chemistry here, but this term apical dominance, and what that really is referring to is energy allocation within the tree. Now I said topping is a bad choice, but we talked about why it can be useful here. We're taking away the apical dominance at the very top of this tree because we want to redistribute those growth hormones further down and have those buds shoot out. You can see that why that's a problem with topping a mature tree. Colleague Guy Ames, if any of you have bought trees from him, he has a good analogy. It's like medieval times or something like that of a king dying, a king without any heirs. And you have all these players coming in trying to take the throne. And that's what's happening within the tree. You cut off the head, and there's a lot of contenders, okay? I love that analogy. So what we're trying to do is kind of crown thinning to reduce the overall size. And so what they have done here is this concept, I think I might have mentioned it before, is what's called a modified leader. Let's say our tree is it's too tall. I've got a fruit tree and I don't want it to be that tall. I told you not to top, right? But we're kind of doing that, but not really. So the example of a modified leader, I'm trying to control, I want this to be shorter, and I'm going to come in and make, get on this side, a cut right here, okay? What's going to happen is that energy allocation is going to go to the next one in line. That's going to be my new leader. So I've reduced the height, but I haven't completely taken everything out. I've left an air, if you will. And so this will become our new leader. And we can continually kind of do that over time to try to control the height of the tree.
So Colin, on that cut that you're just talking about, would you cut it perpendicular to the ground, or would you cut it at a 45?
I would cut it at a 45, yes. Perpendicular to the ground, it's going to probably stay open longer. But if we cut it at an angle, it's going to shed water better. Good question.
What was that called, that modified?
A modified leader. We talked about this a little bit already with apples and pears. This is what we're going for, a central leader. And again, that example I just gave, if this was too tall, I could come take that little one off, and this one's going to be my new leader. Okay, so central leader, modified central leader, and then open center if we're dealing with things like stone fruits. Okay. If we do too much of this, if we remove too much apical dominance, that's what's going to result in sprouts. But it's more forgiving when something is that small. Does that make sense? So yes, this is what I was referring to earlier. Again, it seems counterintuitive to what I've told you, but we've got bare root plants, or a whip as we would call it. We're chopping that off and hoping to stimulate branching lower down the trunk. But be careful, this one's really nice because you can actually see the buds on it. You can see there's a lot of active buds all the way down to about here. If you didn't see that, maybe wait a little bit until it starts to wake up a little bit more. In this case, they've already done it. Now, I'm a bit particular. I'd probably come in and clean that up a little bit. Just above that new bud. And what's going to happen is that's probably going to be my new leader. Okay.
So if you didn't do that, are you at risk of your tree just going all the way up to heaven?
Possibly, yes.
We have a couple of trees that are way too tall.
Yeah.
Me too, pears.
Pears, yes.
Oh,
Pears are really tough because they tend to do that, right?
Oh, they go straight up.
And they are just characterized by those really tight branch angles. They've got a lot of vertical growth that makes them just a little bit more difficult to make a decision when you're pruning.
What's the term for non-stone fruits, apples and pears? What is there a word for?
It varies. I mean, I would call them, kind of palm fruits. Yeah. But most of them are in the rose family. So this is looking at, let's say, this says first year. That's more like, this is probably more like second year.
Right.
You've got that whip established. It's put out some lateral branches, but we're trying to really prune for the structure of this tree. And this one, why did they take that out? Crossing the other one, and this one's got a better angle, correct? This one they maybe could have left, but it's starting to go a little bit too up, so they've taken that off. It's kind of that staggered, stair-stepped look. Okay, but we've got to watch out for those crossing limbs. Also, anything that's growing back towards the center. That's it's gonna crowd our light and air movement and light penetration. It's generally not good fruit supporting wood. So this is one I'm definitely taking out when we do the demonstration. Did I miss anything here? Oh, also one thing to think about, the limbs that are growing too low. You're trying to mow around them possibly, and you don't want to get hit in the head or hit in the shin. So this is pretty nice because it doesn't have limbs that are too low. I'd say, one exception of this that I kind of maybe would like to see is there's so many maples that are planted in new developments, and maples are very thin barked, and they're susceptible to winter or summer injury called sunscald. You see a big wound that goes all the way down, and basically this is the right time for it to happen. It's dormant, but the sun's lower on the horizon. We get a warm week like this, and those cells are like, hey, it's time to wake up, let's go. And then the overnight temperature plummets to freezing, those cells burst, and then you're left with a wound. So I'd kind of, in some of those cases, I'd like to see them leave more lower branches for a while to help shade that, and then take them off at a later time. Another alternative would be to possibly wrap it lightly with like a burlap tree wrap. You can find that online. I don't know if they sell it here or not. But you're looking for balance, just like in most things, right? We don't want all branches on one side that starts to pull the tree one way, okay? So we get that stair step effect. So this is what it looks like before and after. They've made some decisions about which branch structure they've liked. They said this is too crowded. They've taken some of those off and thinned it out. Much cleaner, much more light penetration and air movement, correct? You also hear me okay, or am I tailing off? Okay.
Yeah.
Question?
For that picture, I mean, obviously it's two-dimensional. So would you be going for that, like this way and that way? Or?
Yes. If you were looking at this overhead, it'd probably look more like a star.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
all right.
So there are things coming off this way. It's not just scarecrow.
Okay.
Good question. This is that modified central leader I just talked about. Modified form of topping. Don't tell anyone I told you that, but it is. But it's smaller. We're not taking 8 feet off. That's going to probably be a little bit overstimulating. But if it's something that we can manage, that's 12 inches or less, they've taken that off, and those growth hormones are going into this and saying, now you're in the driver's seat. Okay? Patience and persistence. This is the hard part for all of us when it comes to gardening. I've made that mistake plenty of times too. It gets like this. You want to get out and start getting things in the ground, but I learned that the hard way when it snowed in May. I usually wait till Mother's Day to put my vegetables out. But that's the case with fruit trees as well. is, even if you're doing a good job on a central leader or the modified central leader, it's still going to be stimulating. And that's why we kind of say that rule of not removing more than 1/3. We don't want to create more work for ourselves.
Cut our spouts out.
Right. So we're trying to do this in stages, and it makes sense with fruit trees because many of them, especially with apples and pears, it's going to be a good 5 to 7 years before you're really starting to produce enough to eat. So we can take that time and slowly develop our structure. Okay. So be patient, be persistent in pruning out those upright sprouts, and try to favor outwardly growing limbs. Yes.
I have a question on those when they're growing
Vertically.
more vertically. Are you better off pruning them or trying to train them? Like, what's the rule of thumb?
It really depends. To me, again, I'm sure it's kind of hard for you to see in this one or maybe this one. It's going to be a little bit hard to push that out far enough.
Okay.
Or like this one, for example, that one's already split. It might be a little tough if it's perfect, 90 degrees straight up to get that out. So for me, I think it would be simpler just to, if it's got something like this below it, to choose that to keep.
Okay.
If you don't have that option, you could certainly try it. So it might take 3 or 4 years to really get this in shape, is my point, before it's in a more manageable state. This applies a lot to, really I put this in here about overgrown orchards. It can be a beast. It can feel really overwhelming. You've got to go at it slow. You've got to think about this as a long-term 3 to 5 year project. Removing that third each year slowly so you're not overstimulating it, so you can get it back into production. And I'm including that modified central leader for something that's overgrown or neglected. Okay. Again, this is just some examples of, this is a tree. This is actually not a fruit tree that's in my yard. It's a beautiful tree. It's a fringe tree. Anybody has seen those? Nice spring flowering tree. But this is what I would want if I had an apple. This is what I would want it to look like. You can see there's a lot of space in the middle. I just pruned this 2 days ago. And the nice thing is I've done it so persistently each year. I think I made 12 to 15 cuts of very small things. Anything that was growing back towards the center or that was too close to another one, that's all I had. I could hold it in one hand. And that's going to be pretty much every year for me now. So the more you stay on top of it on the front end, the less you have to do, hopefully, down the line. And I'm just not overstimulating it. Again, this is a walnut tree. Again, nice open center. This is what we're not trying to do. This is that example of topping. It looks terrible. It is terrible for the tree. It's going to die, but you can see it's got some growth back on it.
Really thick in the middle. And
Yes.
Yeah.
That would have benefited from a lot of earlier thinning cuts in the middle, but it might be kind of hard to see. There's a lot of lush growth in there, but it's all new. It's all started from a single shoot. It's like I've got to get up and get sunlight, and it's super weak. Again, this is when one's dormant. You see all those, basically those little whips. So very, very unhealthy practice. Don't do it. For Northwest Arkansas, I mentioned this in the beginning, your best chance for success, again, are the apples and the pears. And then I've listed some of our native fruits. Persimmon, pawpaw, I've got 4 of them. I don't even mess with pruning. We've got 3 at work. Very rarely do I get out and prune them, unless there's something like, it does have some, especially from the base, it'll put up new branches and it might be growing into another one. I might thin that out a little bit, but it's pretty hands off when it comes to pruning. To me, pawpaws, mulberries. Serviceberry is one that I would pay a lot of attention to pruning, again, just to have a good open structure in the middle. I'm still kind of going with that central leader system, not necessarily an open center. They're a delightful fruit. Kind of looks like a little pink blueberry. It kind of tastes like one with a little bit of almond flavoring. It blends very well in a dessert with mulberries, wild forage mulberries, delicious. Elderberries, of course, aren't a tree. I do thin those out a little bit. They put up new canes, but it's not something of too big of a concern. It's a pretty nice hands-off plant, but it will spread. So that's where I'm going in and pruning to make sure it doesn't get out of where I want it to be. Okay. Grapes is a whole other story. I'm not going to have time to get into that today. It's a little bit more complex. Where I've seen as an extension agent, I've been with extension since 2013, and I've been in the hort position since 2019. I get a lot of frustrated folks calling me with stone fruits. Often because they had just bought stuff at the wrong place. They don't, I'm asking, what's the variety? I don't know. Probably not adapted to here. But they have a lot of disease. There's a lot of insects out there that like to eat the same things that we do, right? Squash. But there's a lot of bugs, fruit fly types that really love peaches, worms, but there's a lot of fungal diseases too. One of the worst ones that I get calls about is brown rot. And it's really devastating. It's heartbreaking because you have this beautiful crop, but the peaches aren't ripe yet, and like overnight, you walk out the next day and this is on there. It's instantaneous. And they're really tough to control diseases. Most peaches are nectarines, at least up here. You're looking at needing to spray fungicide and insecticide at minimum, probably 7 times a season, if not more. But if you are interested in that, we have a spray schedule on how to do it. But it can be tough. And also with those late freezes, we see a lot of blossoms just get killed when you're getting down below 28 degrees and those blossoms have already opened up. So for a lot of people, it's maybe one every 7, one every 10 years that you get something that you can actually use. I'm not saying don't do it, I'm just saying know what you're getting into. Okay. Figs, I've got a couple of figs, and I'm just realistic about it. They die back in the winter. I haven't found one myself yet that.
Mine doesn't die back.
Yours doesn't die back. How big is it?
Well, this tall right
Pretty good
now,
size, huh?
But I got it from my neighbor, and his would grow as tall as this.
Yeah, I've seen some very large figs, very well established, that seem to have a little bit more resilience in the winter. But mine are rather small, and this is year 3 that they've died back, and I'm not surprised with negative temperatures.
I did lose it once.
Yeah.
I think it was because we didn't get any water in the fall, and I put water in, and I think I killed it.
That is a really good point that you just brought up. Is we need to make sure that we don't neglect watering in the fall and winter if it gets really dry. I mean,
It
there's
was raining in September, and it didn't that year.
right. So just because it's cool and it's not a drought situation doesn't mean that there aren't water requirements. And for me, the best thing to do is go out and feel the soil. Dig some up, put your fingers in it, and you can usually feel if there's adequate moisture in there or if it's too dry and it's just falling apart. Give it a drink. So don't neglect watering in the winter. You don't need to do it as much, right? I get a lot of calls about tropical or exotic fruits that aren't adapted to this area. I generally try to dissuade people from doing that, but there's some people you can't convince. But it's not generally good practice if it's meant to be growing in Florida or further south than there. Again, grapes are kind of similar. There's quite a few diseases and insect issues on grapes. Muscadines are delightful. Love the taste of them, but they're one that's also likely to die back with harsh winters that we've had. But if you can get them to go, man, call me over. I want to eat something. Anybody seen this? This is another disease that we see a lot on our apples and pears, cedar apple rust. Really beautiful fungus. Really neat looking, but it's got, the reason it's called cedar apple rust is it has 2 hosts. It's hosted by cedar and moves over to apple and pear. So that's something that's pretty easy when you're choosing varieties. That's a very common one that you see resistance to is cedar apple rust. If you can get cedar apple rust and fire blight together, that's huge. That's what I would be looking for.
Did you say anything about citrus, or is that the same as like exotic?
I would throw that in. Citrus is not really, unless you're doing, I've seen people do it indoor. Actually had a person bring in a sample of a Meyer lemon that was 50 years old this week, inside. They kept it inside, had a little bit of a whitefly issue, but it's something that's pretty easily controllable with an insecticidal soap. But outdoors,
Yeah.
not likely to work. Now, if you're in Arizona or Florida, go for it, right? Some tips for success, again, use our publications. It's gonna have those disease-resistant cultivars in there. Talk to other people you know that have had experience. Go visit Ames Orchard if you like. Talk to your nurseries. They're gonna be trying to pull in plants that are gonna do well here. Okay? Scout often. A lot of people think, this is a weird thing. When I was like a teenager and I was trying to go to sleep, I loved watching infomercials because they're fairly boring, but it's really fun to see how much they overreact. But I think about like the Ron Popeil guy that had the rotisserie oven blender, whatever, food dehydrator, set it and forget it.
Yeah.
That is not how fruit trees are. You don't just plant them and walk away. This is something you're really, kind of think about it like a partnership. It's not an ornament. It's a partnership between you and that tree, because it's going to be you're wanting it to give you something. You got to pay attention to it as well. Okay, so scout often. Try to manage those diseases. Get on a timely pruning schedule. It will save you a lot of trouble in the future. I mentioned stone fruits are difficult here. It's not impossible, but it's tough, especially if you're trying to do that organically. There's not a lot of organic options for the disease and pest control on those specific trees. But be realistic about it. Set yourself a timeline, and most importantly, buy healthy plants from reputable sources that have resistance if you can. Watch out for those sprouts from grafted rootstocks. That is, again, that's not the desirable fruit that you want. It probably doesn't taste good. It probably doesn't look good. So prune out those suckers. Don't use the wound dressing. Typically, that's more harm than good. Again, it tends to trap moisture and cause more rapid decomposition of the tissue. And that, with respect to fire blight, another reason you don't want to overstimulate that tree, those water sprouts are the ones that are really susceptible to contracting fire blight. They're tender and young, and they are just more a better foothold for that disease to get into the tree. So trying to minimize those will help minimize that fire blight. These are just some examples of some of our fact sheets. You can go on, I'll give you a hack here. Everybody's talking about life hacks these days. If you don't want to go, you can go to our website and there's a search bar at the top. It's fine. Also, when you go, there's kind of an accordion at the top that says yard and garden. If you hover over that, there's a fruit tree section. Or you can go to Google and type in our acronym, which is UAEX, put a colon after it and a space, and then type it in whatever you're looking for. Let's say apple. The first 3 hits are going to be links to our fact sheets, more than likely. You can do that for anything. It could be for squash or grapes or something like that. We have a specific fact sheet. This one's on pruning. A lot of the material I just gave you. Tree fruit cultivar recommendations. I think this is going to get updated hopefully this year or next year. There are some new varieties that aren't reflected in this. So it's important to look at some of those new varieties and see if it might be, where was it developed is a good thing to keep in mind. But this is just kind of that landing page for home garden fruits and nuts in Arkansas. And that's going to have sections on blackberry and raspberry, which also I'm not going to have time to get into today. I can do another one on that. Then it gets even more specific. We've got fact sheet on pears, on apples, on peaches, on nectarines. So do look for those. They're all on that landing site. Another great resource I want to give a plug for. It was written by Guy Ames through the NCAT ATRA organization. And he's got a great fact sheet that I give to everyone. When we're printing off fact sheets, I give them this one too. And this is specifically if you're interested in organic production. And it's really about pruning and selecting cultivars for disease management. Okay, very, very good publication. And I'll just end, let's see what time these are some common diseases. We're getting close, let's do some cutting. But some common diseases we see, especially with things like apples and pears, is scab. Most of these are fungal diseases, but that can happen on peaches as well. And usually you're going to see that on the fruit. You might see symptoms on the leaves as well. know why I have this in here now. Free resource that we offer 2 free resources to the public. And the first is soil testing, which I highly recommend. Give us a call first. It's to make sure we save you time and save us time, that you don't bring in the wrong thing, that you do it properly. As many samples as you want to bring in, it's free, but it has to be native mineral soil. If it's compost or heavily amended, we can test that, but it's not free. Okay, it goes to a different lab. Our other free service is a plant disease clinic. So you can bring in any type of plant sample that looks funny, you're not sure what's going on, we can take that. Luckily the lab is right across on the U of A farm, so you're at an advantage to the rest of the people in the state that have to mail them in. I take them directly over. Zeb was my our intern this summer, and how many samples do you think you took over there?
Too many.
Too many, that's right. I went over there 3 times yesterday with samples, and unfortunately the person that runs that lab is, well, good for her, but unfortunate for us, retired yesterday. Her name is Sherry Smith, delightful speaker, expert in plant pathology, but that lab's gonna continue going, so again, it's free. If something looks strange, you don't know what's going on, they'll put it under the scope or run a test on it, and they'll email you a report of here's what we found. And if there's a treatment, they'll tell you what it is. Yes?
Is that available if you're in Benton County
Yes.
as well? Okay.
Yeah, you can either take it to Ryan Neal, my colleague in Benton County, to that office, and they
Okay.
will bring it down, or you
Okay.
can bring it directly to the lab yourself.
Okay.
That is open to the public too.
When you addressed fire blight, what about the cedar apple rust? Is there
Sometimes, the general, you're not gonna like the answer, but the general recommendation is try to minimize the amount of cedar trees in the vicinity of your orchard. There are some fungicides that are labeled for organic production. They're usually copper-based, that can slow them down. It's not going to eradicate them though. But the main thing with fire blight is your control method for there is that pruning method I mentioned, which is cutting 8 to 12 inches away from where the infection occurs. Again, cedar apple rust, you just asked about this. Usually it's characterized by that orange glob that you see, but on the leaves it'll show little orange pustules. So some of those copper fungicides can help control that. Brown rot is just tough. Moist, humid conditions are where it's happiest. It's tough to control. All right. And that's also, the Plant Disease Clinic has a great website with pictures of these things. So you can also, if you couldn't bring something in, you can try to compare what you have at home with some of the photos that they have on the Plant Health Clinic website. I'm not gonna have time to get into the small fruits, but let's really quick with the time we have left, it's just a few minutes, look at how I would approach these. We've already talked about the whips. So again, on this one, I'm planting this new. You don't have to, but if for me, I'm probably gonna come in and snip that out there. I'm not gonna do it to this one because whoever buys it may not want that.
Right.
But I'm doing that topmost outer bud. I'm cutting at about a 45-degree angle to help shed that water off. And then this is gonna branch out and become a new leader, okay? This is not a fruit tree, it's a red bud, but there's a lot of good examples of what we could take out here.
Looks like it was top.
It was, and I'm glad you pointed that out. I didn't notice it at first. This would be a great example. Like they've basically done a modified leader system here, but they cut it a little bit too high. And if I had a step ladder, I'm gonna come in
And trim it, yeah.
take it right there, right? The same thing here. That's a reduction cut. Remember, a heading cut? That's no benefit to this tree,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you would that one off to do that.
right? What else? These, I'm with you. I don't like this one. It's going to be going straight up. Get right outside that color. Try to get a good clean cut. This one's a maybe. It's going the right direction, but it's coming out at that same spot. There could be a weak point there.
Okay. How many would you let come out of a similar place?
I prefer one.
Okay.
I prefer one, because at some point that's going to grow and get larger. They're going to start compressing against each other. One's going to get weak, or they're going to start rubbing together too.
So how are you gonna prioritize so that you only take 25%? Because you got ones going down, you got ones crossing, you've got ones.
It depends on my goals. So if this was larger, the larger the branch, the less I'm going to be able to take if I'm going to meet that 1/3 criteria. The nice thing again about doing this when a tree is small, you can take more. Another funny thing that Guyans will say, especially with regard to fruit trees, it's kind of an old adage, if you will. He said it two different ways. I like the first way I ever heard him say it was, you want to be able to throw a cat through it and it not get caught up on a branch. Or a large bird to be able to fly through and not get its hat knocked off. This is another one that's kind of weird. It's kind of overlapping this branch. This branch is kind of rubbing. You can actually take that one. But this one comes up and out. That one doesn't bother me that much. Same thing here that we had at the top. I don't want to leave that little stem. I didn't get a big full cut there. That's already dead, that's why.
Yeah.
So the inside of that, see, it's got black on the inside. It was already starting to decay. So what's left is that little stub. Okay. What about this one? Kinda not great.
Towards the center, that's no good.
Yeah, it's going back towards the center, but also they've done a reduction
Yeah,
cut there.
I know,
There's not.
yeah.
This doesn't appear to be there might be a bud right there, and if there is, and I wanted to keep that branch, I could come in and cut right outside of that bud, and hopefully that'll shoot out this way. But I don't really love that one going up to the top.
Yeah.
Similarly here, this is different. This is a black gum, a type of tupelo. And this is a special variety that's meant to be a really columnar, a tightly bound tree that's a column kind of growth habit. But still, this one, I've been touching this one all day. It's rubbing, right? It's rubbing on this branch. And it's coming through and as this leafs out, it's gonna really congest the interior of that. So that's one. Oh, look how much better. This one too. This one's going right back towards the trunk. It's small.
Yeah.
Lift that up. Now we've got more space, right? I can get my hand in there where I couldn't before. And the same with this little guy. If this was not a columnar tree and it was just, this is one that's meant to be growing up and out like a standard central leader tree, I'm definitely taking this out. Especially at the very least, that one. But I'm probably thinking that's not doing any good for me. I'm going to take that whole thing out if this was a fruit tree. Right?
Are you leaving about the size of the bud when you cut those off?
I'm sorry, say again?
Are you leaving about the size of a bud when you're cutting that little limb
As
off?
far when I'm doing that thinning cut,
Yeah.
you mean on the actual stem?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's really pretty close to about the size of a bud.
Yeah, not
but
flush.
yeah, not flush. Again, it's a little bit tougher to see on a small branch tree like this. It hasn't fully developed that branch collar yet. But you think about it just like your collar. This is thicker, and then my neck is thinner, right? And I'm cutting right outside of that collar. Okay, it's a little bit tougher to see on this, but the more you do it, the more you can say that's where it's going to be when it starts to develop and grow. So yeah, it's probably 1/8 of an inch or so. Okay. This isn't my tree. I don't want to go just butchering it and cutting 2 more, but if you want me to, I can do a few more. But let's open it up for some questions. Yes.
So what are your thoughts on staking up branches either to the trunk
Thank
or
you.
on a T-post or desperately trying not the branch to break?
I'm really glad you asked that. If you are I'm of the school of thought that trees shouldn't be staked, but there's obviously circumstances where they need a little help. If you are going to stake and support a tree, it should happen for no more than a year. After a year, that needs to come off. And a good way to think about this is, anybody ever broken their arm? Okay, you're in a cast for what, 6 weeks, 8 weeks? And they take that off, you aren't going right to the gym after that, are you? you got to rebuild that muscle and that movement and that circulation. Well, the tree's the same way. If you're artificially supporting it, especially if it's not moving at all with the wind, it's not building up any strength. In fact, I saw a picture, one of our specialists showed a photo of a shopping mall, and they had this tree that was planted inside. It was a really tall mall, I guess, multi-story, right? And they had a big planter and this perfectly straight trunk. And the tree failed one day. It broke right at the bottom, never experienced wind, never experienced any kind of resistance. It was very weak, okay? So the longer we stake, it's just like that cast. We take it, you know. The other thing that I see happen way too often, you need flex. If you are staking, it needs to be able to move. It shouldn't be tight and rigid. It should be, you know, some material that's got some flex in it. But if it's left on too long, you'll often see the tree get girdled by that material. Especially, you'll see people put a piece of hose around there, which they're trying to protect the bark. Some people don't. They just put wire around there, and you take that off, and you see a big. That is a point of weakness, and you get wind or ice, that's where it's going to break. Okay, very good question. So if you are doing it, I like to see a kind of a two-stake system, one on each side, and you're putting those on the side of where the direction of the wind is coming from. So if the wind's coming through here, I've got a stake here and here with my guy wires going up, so that tree can still move with the wind a little bit. And I lost my train of thought. I was going to tell you something else. Yeah, just take it off after a year.
Oh, take it off the branch, basically.
Yeah, take it off after a year.
That's our mulberry tree that was there before we bought it, and it was just already big, and now it's bigger.
Yeah.
And that's where all the fruit seems like it's on the branch that we had the stakes that looked like it was going to rip off.
Yeah. Yeah. People forget sometimes, and it's a shame because it ends up girdling the tree. Nita?
How are the information sheets put out by UA here for specific for our zones? Is Arkansas has two
It's
zones?
statewide. It's statewide. So one thing to pay attention to on there is often in those sheets they'll mention
Our zone.
different zones. Okay. If you go look, another really good resource is like our annual planting calendar. That's mainly for vegetables, but it shows a map of Arkansas, 2 of them in fact, and it shows the last average freeze date and the first average freeze date for each different zone of the state.
Because I know the stuff they do in the Clarksville experimental station that have been developed for Arkansas, some of those aren't, because of our
That's
new
true.
application line, they don't look at.
That is true, and that's where you would call me. Call your local agent, and if we don't know the answer, we'll ask the specialist. We'll find it for you, but they typically will, in the profile of those new varieties that they're releasing, they'll say this one is not going to be going to Northwest Arkansas. This is going to be Zone 7B or whatever it is. Yeah,
Indian blackberries.
yeah. Most all the blackberries do just fine up here.
And are the sheets still out in the hall, main hall?
Yes, yeah. So if you come into our office, we have a couple of kiosks with a lot of these fact sheets, but we've got too many of them. We don't have space for all of them. So if there's something specific that you're looking for that you didn't find yourself or you don't have a printer, just come in and we will go print it off for you. It's simple as that.
Like that.
Yeah.
What
You
zone
printed that
are
yourself?
No, I
Oh, you came
I
in and
go
got it?
there about once a month for
Okay.
everything, and I get to go.
Well, I've got some help now this year, and she's really been reorganizing those kiosks and taking out outdated materials and trying to put in things that are relevant that people are really interested in. And so she tries to keep that well stocked. Yes.
So we've had our zones changed. What zone is this area?
Yeah. So before we would have been considered 6B.
Right.
So now we would be 7A. I'd take it with a grain of salt. I wouldn't go drastically like stop planting something that you planted before. It's same thing with like the frost dates. Those are averages based on decades and decades of fluctuations, right? Just don't take it as gospel that hey, it says April 20th is gonna be our last freeze. Yeah. So kind of the same thing with that growing zone, but yeah, typically for us, it generally tends to relate to more extreme weather. More extreme cold, more extreme drought, heavier rainfall, or no rainfall. But the last 4 years have been kind of rough. Any other questions? Yes, sir?
I've got a couple of fruit trees where the deer have come in and bucks have just scraped off a huge portion of the bark.
Well, that's two ornamental trees to deer.
So they survived. The trees have been, they made it through 2 years since then. But I'm wondering if I should be approaching pruning any differently than I normally would.
Maybe not so much pruning, but if I was putting in a young tree like any of these here, I would try to put your best effort against them is exclusion. And chicken wire, hardware cloth, or something with a good buffer around it.
Yeah.
You reminded me of something else. That's the best. Mulching. Mulch is very beneficial, but don't overdo it. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So generally 3 to 4 inches max as far as the depth is enough. You see this volcano mulching, that starts to reduce oxygen that can get to the roots. It can harbor varmints, voles, rats, things like that. It can possibly hold too much water, but more often than not, we see it touching the trunk. And that moisture, that stuff there's microbes in there that are basically composting that old mulch. How can they tell the difference if this is getting wet? How can they tell the difference between the mulch and the trunk of that tree? You start to see rot happening and a weakening of that trunk if it's touching it. So give a couple of inch buffer between your trunk and that 3 or 4 inch layer of mulch. But if you do it right, many benefits of mulch. Helping regulate soil temperature, helping conserve moisture and keep those roots cool. Very beneficial, just do it right. I think you reminded me of that, and I don't know if I fully answered your question.
No, that's good.
Yeah,
Lesson
I've lost 2 ornamental trees to deer right in town.
Yep.
And now when I'm putting one out, I'm putting some kind of guard around it.
Yep.
I'm trying not to let it touch the trunk or interfere with the growth at all. That'd be the main thing. So it's kind of whatever you can stand. If you're in a HOA or a POA, they might have some restrictions. I'm glad I don't live in one. Goodness.
Colin,
Yes.
I have a similar question. I had a sawtooth oak that was girdled last fall by a buck that was, and it's, like I said, the main leader is gone, but I've got water sprouts coming up. Should I just, because this thing was 7 years old, should I just cut it out and start over, or can I try to baby one of those water sprouts and make it a new?
That is possible. I'd like to see a picture. Or I do site visits, but a great way to start those is to email me or text me a photo. I feel more comfortable answering it that way than just saying, go for it. If I can get a visual on it, that is huge. And then we can make a better management decision after that.
And what is your email address?
Yeah, and I forgot to put that up there. It's my first initial, my last name. So C Massey, CMASSEY, and that's at UADA.edu. That stands for UA Division of Agriculture.
C Massey at what was it?
UADA.edu. D as in dog. You bet. Any last questions? There's one here in the back.
How close is too close for cedar and apple?
That's tough to say.
I would say,
If you ask someone with a commercial orchard, they'd probably say a mile.
Wow. A mile?
But that's really tough to do in an urban environment because you're probably talking about someone else's tree it's hard to control that. Yeah. Resistant varieties. Last one.
So if you have some apple trees and mine are young, should I be worried about spraying them for insecticides or just let them?
If you're not really seeing symptoms, probably not. Although it's a good point that you bring up. Most fungicides are more preventative in nature
Okay.
than reactive. It's really up to your personal philosophy on that.
Okay.
If you had seen any symptoms before in the past, you know, it's something. There are some that you can do what's called a soil drench, where you mix it up in a bucket and you put it into the root zone. Let's talk about that really quick. What is the root zone of a tree at the very minimum?
Same as the canopy.
Canopy, right? We call it the drip line, the edge of where the leaves are. It's at least out to there.
Yeah, at least, yeah.
And large, you know, things like oaks and hickories that are really mature, it can go 3 times that distance. That's where most of the feeder roots are. That's where you also get a lot of construction damage, because most people think the roots are right there. I'm driving a bulldozer and scraping all this up, or putting in a septic system, you know, right at the edge of the tree. You can actually get damage from that. But that, you know, if it was something you were concerned of and you knew you didn't have resistance in that variety, you could, you know, sometimes they claim to have about 12 months of protection, so you can kind of proactively do that. Sometimes they're combined with an insecticide, but you really want to be careful with that because you need pollinators to come and pollinate those flowers. So I wouldn't do that unless I absolutely knew, or if I was dealing with a peach.
Okay.
Thank y'all. Oh, one more.
Okay, so when we go take out all our cedars, sincerely, what we plant back so the critters have coverage over the season?
Tough question, because there's many varieties that you could do, but it's going to be kind of hard to find a native evergreen that maybe has the exact same growth habit. But honestly, like, how realistic is it to really go cut down all your cedars? I don't know. More than likely, those critters are going to find other habitat if there's natural areas around. But if it were me, I would try to choose. I mean, one of the best things you can do is plant an oak. It's a host to 400 or 500 different insects that are mostly beneficial. Native trees are going to be host plants for all kinds of stuff that you don't see. So I'm going with something native.
Well, I have most of the natives, that's why I wonder if I take those out, what's, I mean,
They'll find a place, I'm sure.
well, they use it for cover, they use it for warmth, they use it for crop. That was the weird reason.
Thank y'all so much. Come visit me, give me a call.